The sky above Delhi was soft and golden that evening, carrying the calm after a long day of storms. The airport was full of tired travelers waiting for their flights, each face showing its own story. Sundar Pichai walked quietly through the crowd, dressed simply, carrying only a small bag. He had just finished attending a long global summit about digital education and kindness initiatives. Instead of taking a private jet or first class, he chose an economy seat on a regular domestic flight to Chennai. He wanted some silence, some distance from the endless attention that followed him everywhere. As he reached the boarding gate, he noticed people whispering softly. Some recognized him, some only felt they had seen that face somewhere before. Sundar smiled politely and nodded to a young boy who waved shyly at him. He had no bodyguards, no assistant, just his soft voice and calm eyes. Inside, he felt peace. He had promised himself long ago never to forget the simplicity that shaped his journey from a small home in Chennai to leading one of the biggest companies in the world. After a short delay, passengers began boarding. The flight was nearly full. Families with children, elderly travelers, and business people filled the narrow aisle. Sundar took his seat near the window, quietly placing his bag under the front seat. Outside, the evening light touched the runway like a golden reflection of memory. As the last few passengers entered, an elderly man appeared at the gate. He looked frail but proud, wearing an old blazer and holding a small cloth bag close to his chest. The man walked slowly, one step at a time, his eyes filled with both dignity and exhaustion. The air hostess guided him to row 11, but soon confusion spread. Another traveler had already been assigned that same seat. The crew began to check the boarding passes again, their voices polite but uncertain. The elderly man stood there quietly, not complaining, only saying in a low voice, "It's all right, I can stand if needed." His words made the passengers fall silent for a moment. Sundar watched from a few rows behind. Something in that man's tone reminded him of his father's quiet strength. He pressed the call button, stood up, and said gently, "Please let him have my seat. I will move to the back." The air hostess hesitated. "Sir, it's a long flight. We can find another arrangement." But Sundar simply smiled and replied, "It's all right. I will be fine." The old man turned to him with surprise, his hands trembling slightly. "You don't have to, son," he said softly. Sundar nodded, his voice calm. "Please, sir, you remind me of someone I respect deeply." The old man placed his bag on the seat and tried to thank him, but Sundar had already walked toward the rear of the plane. He took a foldable crew seat near the emergency exit. Passengers whispered quietly among themselves. Some took photos, realizing who he was. But Sundar didn't care. To him, it wasn't a gesture to be seen, only something that felt right. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the cabin lights dimmed. Sundar looked around. People were still staring at him with quiet admiration. He smiled and opened a small notebook he always carried. On the first page were written words his mother once told him, "Never stop being kind, even when no one sees it." He smiled faintly and began to write something new beneath it. Soon after takeoff, the night outside turned deep blue. The flight was calm, but Sundar noticed the old man looking uncomfortable. He called a stewardess and said, "Please check if that gentleman needs water or a blanket." She nodded and returned a few minutes later, saying the man was fine, but wanted to thank him again. Sundar waved his hand slightly, asking her to tell him it was nothing. Halfway through the flight, turbulence hit suddenly. A few passengers gasped as the plane shook. The old man's small cloth bag slipped from his lap and fell to the floor. Papers and old envelopes scattered near his feet. The air hostess rushed to help, and Sundar, from the back, stood up instinctively. But the hostess reached first, picking up the fallen items. One of them was a faded blueprint with hand-drawn lines and small notes written neatly in the corner. Another was a brown envelope marked, "It Records." She placed them back in the bag and smiled kindly at the old man, who nodded with gratitude. Sundar watched the scene carefully. Something about that envelope caught his attention. "It Records." His thoughts drifted back to his own days at the Indian Institute of Technology. Those long nights in the computer lab, the smell of chalk and soldering irons, the endless lessons about patience and precision. He remembered a professor who once told him, "You will go far, but don't forget to look back." That voice still echoed somewhere in his memory. The seatbelt sign turned off and calm returned. The elderly man opened a small diary and began reading a page. Sundar noticed his eyes glistening under the dim light. He wanted to walk up and speak to him, but decided to wait. Something told him this journey was not just about reaching Chennai. It was leading him towards something unfinished, something hidden in time. As the flight continued, a soft conversation began between passengers. The man seated beside the elderly traveler asked, "Sir, were you a teacher?" The old man smiled gently. "Yes, long ago. But now I just travel to meet my past students and see what they built." His words touched Sundar deeply. A quiet realization began to form, but he wasn't sure yet. His heart felt a strange mix of respect and suspense. Could it be? Could that old teacher be someone he once knew? As the night grew darker, the engines hummed steadily. Sundar closed his eyes for a moment, his mind replaying flashes from his college days, a time when he was still unsure of his future. He remembered a man with kind eyes and steady hands who had once stood beside him in a lab and said, "Remember, Sundar, innovation is not in circuits, it is in compassion." That line had never left him. He wondered if fate was giving him a chance to repay a debt that could never be repaid fully. A few minutes later, the hostess approached him quietly. "Sir, the elderly gentleman would like to know your name. He said he wants to thank you properly after landing." Sundar smiled faintly and said, "Tell him my name won't matter. His comfort does." She nodded and walked away, but the moment stayed heavy with feeling. Sundar looked out the window into the vast night sky and whispered softly to himself, "Sometimes the universe arranges meetings when the time is right." As the plane descended through layers of clouds, lights of Chennai began to appear below like small stars. Passengers prepared to land. Sundar noticed the old man carefully folding his blueprints again, as if they held his entire life. When the wheels touched the runway, a round of polite applause filled the cabin, a tradition some travelers still followed in gratitude for safe landings. While others rushed to get off, the elderly man waited patiently. His hands shook slightly as he tried to stand. Sundar walked forward, offering his arm for support. "Let me help you, sir." The man smiled gratefully and said, "You are too kind." "Young man," Sundar replied softly, "kindness built me." "Sir." As they walked down the narrow aisle together, another small envelope slipped from the old man's bag. This time Sundar picked it up. His eyes froze as he read the corner of the envelope. It was addressed to, "My dearest student Sundar." He looked up slowly, his breath caught between shock and emotion. His eyes met the old man's, who now looked confused. The suspense filled the air like a quiet storm waiting to break. The engines fell silent. The world outside waited. And Sundar realized the story he thought had ended long ago was only beginning again, 30,000 feet above the ground. The cabin lights glowed softly as passengers began leaving their seats. Sundar stood still, holding the brown envelope in his hand, his eyes unable to move from the faded writing on it. The words, "My dearest student Sundar," seemed to echo louder than the hum of the engines. The old man adjusted his glasses and looked at Sundar with confusion. He said gently, "Thank you again, young man. May I have that envelope back?" Sundar handed it to him carefully, still staring in disbelief. His voice trembled slightly as he said, "Sir, did you ever teach at IIT Madras?" The old man looked surprised for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes, many years ago. I taught electrical engineering there until my eyesight began to fail. Those were beautiful days." His tone was calm, but behind it lay a quiet sadness, like a teacher who had outlived his classroom. Sundar felt his heart beating faster. He took a deep breath and asked softly, "Sir, may I know your name?" The old man smiled faintly and replied, "Professor Krishnan, though I doubt anyone remembers me now." His words pierced through Sundar like a wave of emotion. He remembered that name, that voice, that same calm tone that once guided him when he was a nervous student. For a moment, Sundar could not speak. Memories rushed back like old film reels. Long nights at the lab, quiet lectures filled with wisdom, and the day when Professor Krishnan told him not to give up on his dream of connecting India through technology. The same professor who once lent him a small notebook when Sundar could not afford one. Sundar finally said in a trembling voice, "Sir, you may not remember me, but I remember you. I was in your class in 1990. I used to sit near the window and ask too many questions." Professor Krishnan looked at him closely, squinting as if trying to see through time itself. "Sundar," he whispered softly, almost uncertain. Sundar nodded gently, his eyes misty. The professor's hands shook slightly as he reached out and touched Sundar's shoulder. "My boy, you became—" His voice broke before he could finish the sentence. Sundar quickly held his hand and said, "Because of you, sir. Because you taught me how to dream without fear." The air hostess standing nearby watched silently, tears forming in her eyes. Other passengers paused, realizing something deeply emotional was happening. The old teacher who had once shaped minds had just been found by one of his brightest students, now one of the most respected leaders in the world. The professor smiled faintly. "I thought I would never see you again. I often wondered where my students ended up. Life took me away from teaching when my wife fell ill. I sold my house and moved around helping where I could. I still kept my notes just in case one of my students would remember." He looked down at his small bag filled with yellowed papers. "These are not blueprints, Sundar. They are lessons I wrote for students who could not afford books." Sundar listened quietly, his throat tightening. "Sir, you gave your life to education and still live with such humility. You never stopped teaching, did you?" The professor chuckled softly. "Teaching never ends, my boy. It only changes classrooms." As they walked toward the airport exit, the professor moved slowly, leaning slightly on Sundar's arm. Travelers passing by looked curiously at the sight of a tech giant walking beside an old man with such gentle care. But Sundar didn't care who watched. For him, this was not a public act. It was a personal circle completing itself. In the arrival hall, Sundar asked politely, "Sir, where will you go now? May I arrange a car for you?" The professor shook his head. "No need, my son. I take the local bus. I like watching people. They remind me of my students, always rushing, always learning." Sundar smiled and said, "Then please allow me to accompany you at least until you reach home." The professor hesitated, but Sundar's warmth convinced him. They walked together to the taxi area. The driver looked surprised when Sundar opened the door for the professor, insisting he sit first. "You should not do this, my boy," the professor said softly. Sundar replied, "Sir, I am still your student. Today, let me learn from you once more." The city lights of Chennai passed by outside, glowing through the window like memories reborn. The air smelled of rain and earth, and for a while both sat in silence. Then the professor spoke slowly. "You know, Sundar, I once wrote a letter for you after you graduated. But you had already left for America before I could give it. I kept it all these years, waiting for the right time." He opened his bag and took out the very envelope Sundar had seen on the plane. His hands trembled as he gave it to him. "Here, my boy. This belongs to you." Sundar opened it carefully. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, its edges yellowed with age. Written in neat old handwriting were the words, "Dear Sundar, never measure your success by titles or wealth. Measure it by how many lives you lift quietly along the way. If you ever find yourself too far from humility, remember your classroom. Remember your roots. Remember that the greatest innovation is kindness." Below the letter was a simple line, "Your proud teacher, Krishnan." Sundar's eyes filled with tears. He looked up and said, "Sir, your words were true. I may have built technology for millions, but you built me, and that made all the difference." The professor smiled gently. "Then you understood the lesson. I can rest, knowing one student remembered the purpose." They reached the professor's small apartment, an old building with peeling paint, but warmth shining through the windows. Inside were stacks of old books, chalk boxes, and photographs of students long forgotten by the world. Sundar felt his chest tighten as he looked around. "Sir, you still keep your classroom alive." The professor laughed softly. "Every corner of this house is a blackboard, Sundar. I teach a few children from the neighborhood. They come every evening. Knowledge must keep breathing." Sundar's phone kept buzzing, but he ignored it. He wanted this moment to stay untouched by the noise of the world. He sat down on a simple wooden chair and said, "Sir, do they know who you really are?" The professor shook his head. "No, my son. They only need to know what kindness looks like, not who gives it. The rain outside began to fall harder, tapping gently on the window. Sundar felt something change inside him, a deep reminder of the roots he often missed in his busy life. As the evening grew darker, the professor took out an old framed photo from the shelf. It showed a young Sundar in his college days, standing beside him in a small classroom, smiling shyly. "I kept this picture all these years," the professor said. "Every time I felt forgotten, I looked at it and told myself, one day this boy will do something great." Sundar smiled, his voice breaking. "Sir, you believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And today, I see what faith truly means." They sat in silence for a while, two generations joined by gratitude and time. Before leaving, Sundar said, "Sir, may I visit again tomorrow?" The professor nodded kindly. "You don't have to promise, my boy. Just keep doing what you do with heart. That's the best visit any teacher could wish for." Sundar smiled and bowed respectfully, touching the professor's hand before leaving. Outside, the city lights blurred through the rain as he walked slowly to his car. He looked back once more at the small apartment, its single lamp glowing softly through the curtain. He whispered quietly, "Thank you, sir. You gave me more than knowledge. You gave me light." As his car drove away, Sundar didn't realize that the next day would bring something far deeper, a truth about the professor that would shake his heart and change how the world saw kindness itself. The next morning, the sunlight fell softly across Chennai's busy streets. Cars moved slowly through the early traffic, vendors shouted, and birds perched on old wires above the lanes. Sundar woke up early, his mind still filled with thoughts of the night before. The meeting with Professor Krishnan had touched something deep within him. He kept thinking about the small apartment, the old books, and that single glowing lamp that looked like it carried decades of wisdom. He made himself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The professor's letter lay open on his table. Sundar read it again slowly, every line sounding like advice from another time. It spoke not of wealth or achievement, but of purpose and humility. Sundar closed his eyes and whispered softly, "I have achieved much, but maybe I forgot what truly built me." He decided to visit the professor again. But before leaving, he received a message from his assistant. It was a reminder about an urgent online meeting with international partners. Sundar smiled gently and replied, "Reschedule it. Something more important waits for me today." As he drove through the narrow streets, he noticed the small school nearby the professor's home. It looked old but full of life. Children in simple uniforms were laughing near the gate. He stopped the car for a moment, watching them. The sound of their laughter reminded him of his own childhood, the small classroom, the scent of chalk, the joy of learning. When he reached the professor's building, he saw a few neighborhood kids sitting on the staircase, holding notebooks and pencils. They looked excited. One of them, a little girl with bright eyes, said, "Sir is teaching us today. He said a guest might come too." Sundar smiled and asked, "May I join the class if your sir allows?" The children laughed and nodded. He climbed the stairs and knocked gently on the door. The professor's voice came from inside, warm and welcoming. "Come in, Sundar. I was expecting you." Inside, the same soft light filled the room. The professor sat on a low chair, surrounded by children who listened carefully as he explained simple science concepts, using toys and old wires. Sundar watched quietly from the corner, his heart full of admiration. When the class ended, the children stood, bowed respectfully, and left happily with small chocolates the professor gave them. After they left, Sundar asked softly, "Sir, how long have you been teaching these children?" The professor smiled. "Since I retired. Their parents cannot afford good schools, so I try to teach them what I can. I do not have much, but I have time and love. That is enough." Sundar looked around again. He noticed that the walls were cracked, the furniture old, and the books worn out. Yet there was something divine in that small space, an atmosphere of peace and purpose that not even the richest offices could hold. After a few minutes of silence, Sundar said, "Sir, please allow me to help. I can rebuild this place, bring better materials, and give these children the tools they deserve." But the professor shook his head gently. Sundar, kindness must stay silent to remain pure. If we make noise about it, it becomes charity, not compassion. Sundar lowered his eyes in respect. You are right, sir, but I wish the world could see what real teaching looks like. The professor smiled and said, the world does not need to see. It only needs to feel. Just then, an elderly neighbor entered the room. She brought a small steel plate of food for the professor. Here, sir, I made some rice and sambar for you. Sundar thanked her, and the woman smiled. He never eats alone. He always saves half for anyone hungry outside. She left quietly, leaving behind an air of pure respect. As they ate together, the professor looked thoughtful. Sundar, when I left teaching at IIT, many people said I wasted my life by not publishing books or earning awards. But I found peace here, helping small lives grow. Every time a child learns something new, I feel younger again. Sundar smiled. Sir, you taught me that knowledge is light. I see that light in your eyes even now. After lunch, the professor opened a drawer and took out a small box wrapped in old newspaper. This belonged to your batch, he said. After your graduation, your class collected some money for a farewell gift. But I used it differently. He opened the box slowly. Inside were tiny receipts and donation slips, all marked for small rural scholarships. Sundar looked at them with amazement. Sir, you used that money for others? The professor nodded. I used it to start a small fund for poor students. Over the years, I sold my belongings to keep it alive. The fund helped hundreds of children go to school. Sundar felt tears in his eyes. Sir, you gave up everything for others and no one knew. The professor smiled faintly. I never wanted anyone to know. I only wanted the kindness to continue. But recently, I fear it may end soon. Sundar asked softly. Why, sir? The professor looked down. I am old, my health is weak, and the small fund is running out. I only wish it could continue even after me. A silence filled the room. Sundar sat quietly, feeling both sorrow and admiration. He thought of the millions of dollars people spent on temporary things while this man changed lives with almost nothing. Then, in a voice filled with emotion, Sundar said, Sir, it will not end. I promise you that. Your kindness will live forever. The professor smiled weakly, as if hearing words he had waited for all his life. Thank you, my boy. But remember, when you help, do it quietly, like rain that nourishes the earth without thunder. That evening, as Sundar left the apartment, the sun was setting over Chennai. He looked back at the building, at the small balcony where the professor stood waving softly. In that moment, Sundar knew what he had to do. The next day, he called his global team. I want to start a new foundation, he said. It will focus on education and silent kindness. We will call it Seed of Kindness. His team asked why that name. Sundar smiled. Because once, I gave my seat to a man who gave me my place in life. The news did not go public yet. He wanted to keep it secret until the right moment. But fate had more in store. Something that would turn this quiet promise into a story that would move the world. 2 weeks later, Sundar received a letter from Chennai. It was handwritten, sealed carefully. When he opened it, he felt his chest tighten. It was from the neighbor lady who had served them food. Her words trembled with emotion. Dear Sir, Professor Krishnan peacefully passed away last night in his sleep. He asked me to give you his final note. It's in the envelope enclosed. Sundar's hands shook as he opened the small envelope. Inside was a short message in the professor's handwriting. My dear Sundar, do not grieve. I lived a full life and I leave peacefully, knowing that kindness found its way home. Continue the fund. Let every act of humility you do remind you of this seat we shared. One in the sky, one in the heart. Tears streamed down Sundar's face as he folded the letter gently and placed it close to his heart. He looked out the window toward the open sky, whispering, You gave me everything, sir. Now I will give the world what you gave me. And that night, Sundar made a decision that would touch millions of lives, a promise born not from success, but from gratitude. The days after the professor's passing felt quiet and heavy for Sundar. The world around him moved fast, filled with meetings and headlines, but inside he carried only silence. He kept the professor's final letter beside his desk and read it every morning before work. Those words reminded him that greatness means nothing without kindness. One evening, while flying back from a conference, Sundar looked out the airplane window. Below him, the clouds stretched endlessly, glowing softly under the sun. He thought of that first flight, the day he gave up his seat, not knowing it would lead him back to his teacher. The memory made him smile gently. As the plane flew higher, he opened his laptop and began typing a new proposal. It was the final draft for the Seat of Kindness Foundation. The mission was simple: to fund education, honor forgotten teachers, and support humble innovators in villages. Every project would carry a single rule written in bold letters: no names, only impact. A few weeks later, the foundation launched quietly. No press release, no advertisement, only a small message sent to schools and universities across India. Within days, applications began arriving, stories of students, teachers, and inventors who worked selflessly for others. Sundar personally read each one, smiling whenever he found echoes of Professor Krishnan's spirit among them. One morning, his assistant entered the office with an envelope. "Sir, this one came without a name," she said. Inside was a photo of a small village school where children sat on the floor studying beside an old wooden chair. The note read, "This chair once belonged to the teacher who taught us kindness. We kept it for him." Sundar felt his throat tighten. The picture showed the very same wooden chair from Professor Krishnan's room, carried to the school by the children he once taught. Below it, written in small handwriting, were the words, "The seed of kindness lives here now." He smiled softly, whispering, "Yes, sir, it truly does." And from that moment, he knew his teacher's lesson would travel farther than any flight, through classrooms, through hearts, through generations yet to come. Months passed quietly after the foundation began its work. Sundar wanted everything to remain silent, just as Professor Krishnan had wished. Small schools started receiving supplies, teachers were given support, and poor students began studying under better roofs. Every time a project was completed, Sundar smiled softly, remembering his teacher's words. Let kindness work without noise. But sometimes, silence itself creates its own kind of noise. One morning, a journalist from a local newspaper visited one of the small village schools funded by the program. She noticed that none of the donations had any name attached to them. Curious, she began asking questions. When she heard that the fund was called Seat of Kindness, she decided to investigate further. A week later, her article appeared in several Indian newspapers with the headline, "Who is behind the Seat of Kindness?" It told stories of how hundreds of schools had been rebuilt without credit, how teachers were receiving letters of gratitude signed simply as a former student. The mystery caught the world's attention. Soon, news agencies from across the globe began tracing the origin of the foundation. Still, Sundar stayed silent. He neither confirmed nor denied anything, but the truth had its own way of surfacing. One evening, during a global education summit in Delhi, the host mentioned the Seat of Kindness initiative while addressing the audience. The host said, "This program has quietly changed lives across villages, and tonight we honor the mind behind it." As the spotlight moved, the crowd turned to see Sundar standing at the back, surprised and hesitant. The audience rose in applause. He walked slowly to the stage, humble and calm. The host handed him the microphone. For a few seconds, Sundar stayed silent. Then he said softly, "I didn't create this to be seen. I created it to continue something my teacher started." The hall grew quiet as he told the story of the old man on the flight. The envelope marked "My dearest student Sundar" and the lessons that shaped his life. By the time he finished, many in the audience had tears in their eyes. Cameras flashed, but Sundar looked down, saying, "The credit belongs to a teacher who believed that kindness should never need applause." After the speech, social media filled with tributes. Teachers across India shared their own stories of unseen kindness. The hashtag Dasher Seat of Kindness began trending worldwide. That night, Sundar sat alone on the hotel balcony, looking at the stars. He whispered, "Sir, the world finally knows your light." And in the quiet of that moment, it felt as if the sky itself bowed in gratitude. The next morning, the world continued to speak about Sundar's heartfelt words. Newspapers called it one of the most emotional speeches ever delivered by a global leader. But Sundar stayed away from interviews and headlines. He knew Professor Krishnan would not have liked attention. Instead, he focused on expanding the Seat of Kindness Foundation quietly into other countries, helping children from rural communities, refugees, and remote villages access education. One afternoon, he received an invitation from the President of India. The government had decided to honor him for his contributions to education and humanity. Sundar politely declined the award but made one simple request. If possible, he said, let the honor be given to a teacher instead. The request surprised everyone, but it was accepted. Weeks later, a national ceremony was held at the Rashtrapati Bhavan. Dignitaries, ministers, and journalists filled the grand hall. Sundar arrived wearing a simple white shirt, carrying a small wooden box in his hands. When the president invited him to the stage, Sundar stepped forward slowly. "Sir," he said softly, "before accepting anything, I wish to show you something." He opened the box carefully. Inside lay the old, worn-out chair leg from Professor Krishnan's home, the last remaining piece saved when the old apartment building was renovated. He placed it on the stage and said, "This piece of wood once supported a teacher who carried thousands of dreams. It represents every teacher who gave their seat to a student so that we could rise." The hall fell silent. Some wiped their eyes as Sundar continued. "Years ago, I gave my airplane seat to an old man. I thought I was being kind. But that old man turned out to be my professor, the man who gave me my place in life. Since then, I have learned that true success is not measured by how high we sit, but by how many seats we offer others." His words spread through every corner of the room like a gentle wind carrying warmth. The president stood up, folded his hands, and said, "Today, we honor not just a leader, but a student who never forgot his teacher." The entire audience rose in a standing ovation. The moment felt timeless, a tribute not just to Sundar or his professor, but to the quiet power of respect and humility. After the ceremony, Sundar placed the wooden piece in a museum section dedicated to India's educators. A small plaque beneath it read, "The Seat of Kindness, a gift from a teacher to the world." That night, back at his home in Chennai, Sundar sat alone by the window. A cool breeze flowed in, carrying the scent of rain. He opened his notebook and wrote slowly, "Kindness never dies. It only changes hands." He looked up at the night sky and whispered softly, "Sir, I hope you can see how far your lesson traveled." A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, flipping the notebook's pages to the very first one, the one where his mother had once written, "Never stop being kind, even when no one sees it." Sundar smiled, realizing that both his mother and his teacher had built the same truth inside him. In the following months, the Seat of Kindness expanded into every continent, supporting silent heroes, teachers, students, and communities who lived for others. Each story carried a single symbol, a small golden seat, reminding people that humility is the true height of greatness. And though the world continued to celebrate him, Sundar never took credit. He always ended his speeches with the same words, "The man who taught me to dream is the one who deserves this light." Years later, as the foundation marked its anniversary, a small ceremony was held at an old school in Chennai. Children gathered around a new wooden chair placed in the center of the classroom. Beneath it, a brass plate read, "In loving memory of Professor Krishnan, the teacher who gave his seat to the world." The students sat quietly as Sundar spoke to them for a few minutes. "You don't need to be powerful to change the world," he said softly. "You only need to care enough to give your seat to someone who needs it more." When the class ended, a young boy came up to Sundar and asked shyly, "Sir, will people remember him forever?" Sundar smiled warmly and said, "As long as people remember to be kind, he will never be forgotten." The bell rang and the children laughed as they ran outside. Sundar stayed a moment longer, touching the back of the chair gently before leaving. As he stepped out, sunlight streamed through the window and landed perfectly on the seat, glowing softly, like the world itself was bowing in gratitude. From that day on, people across India began placing a small empty chair at school functions and seminars, a silent symbol of respect for every teacher and mentor who shaped the world quietly. It became a tradition called the Seat of Kindness, and somewhere beyond the clouds, it was easy to imagine Professor Krishnan smiling proudly, whispering, "The lesson was learned."